Welcome back to the Hardware Unboxed podcast for episode 49. This is just a random episode talking about all sorts of stuff. We talk about X870 and X870E motherboard testing and all the motherboard stuff. We're going to be talking about AM4 CPUs, 5800 XTD. How good was that CPU? It's now end of life. We're going to be talking about MSI leaking the 9800 XTD information, and then also MSI's weird relationship with AMD at the moment. Lots of speculation there and discussion about maybe AMD is in MSI's bad books or MSI is in AMD's bad books. Not sure what's happening there. Lots of that sort of stuff. And yeah, that pretty much does it for this episode, but we'll get into it. So enjoy. So Steve, we decided to record this podcast at an ungodly hour of the morning.
Yep.
Just fresh out of bed, straight into podcasting because you've got some busy days ahead of you testing some upcoming CPUs. Obviously, Intel Arrow Lake is coming out. So how have you been? How's the testing going over there of various different things?
Flat out. First of all, I'm looking forward to the comments. We're like, Steve, get some rest. You look tired. It's like, well, I feel tired, but it's only because I just woke up not that long ago after a lot of work the day before. But yeah, my week has been pretty full on for various reasons. Obviously, on the side, I'm updating all of our CPU data, and I've just this morning or late last night run into a bit of a hitch with that. So I'll talk about that in a moment, I guess. And for the last month or so, probably a little bit over a month, I've been testing all of these new X870/X870E motherboards.
Yeah.
Way more testing than what we normally do, which I regretted just a few boards in, but I don't know. Balaam was like, the hours you work are just inhuman and insane. I'm like, yeah, I get it. It's kind of like a hobby, so it's fun. But yeah, on this one, I did question my decisions multiple times. You'll see the video. It's absurd. I think it's going to be about 40 minutes long of just nothing but information. As we go through, I think it's about 21 motherboards. But I've done all the testing you saw from that, what was it, the 4 flagship board sort of mini roundup preview thing. I've done all of that testing on about 2021 boards now, plus some additional information. And the problem you have when you spend over a month and you no doubt had this in a lot of the content you've done as well, you just end up with this overwhelming amount of data and amount of products. And you think to yourself, well, if I spend 2 minutes just introducing and showing just the motherboards, for example, that's a 40-minute video.
Yeah.
So I can't really do that. And then if I break down all the data I've got and talk about it, that's like 40 minutes of data analysis. So how the hell do I present over a month's worth of data collection plus introduce all of the products in like a half-hour video? Turns out you can't. Like it's going to be about a 45-minute video. But I've gone with a completely different format to how we've done it before. So it's sort of a very brief introduction to the motherboard. I don't know, 20 to 30 seconds. Then we're doing those, those USB performance images where I basically essentially benchmark every port on the rear I/O, which people love. So I'm like, all right, I'm gonna do that. So I've done that for 21 motherboards. So I've got 21 of those images. So I spend 30 seconds just quickly going over each one of those. And
right, so that's 10 minutes for 20 boards, right?
And then I have so much information, like actually, if I bring one up real quickly here. But yeah, I've created a scorecard to try and break down all the information in a way that is easy for the viewer to digest, while also clearly conveying all that information. So on the scorecard, for example, we've got the average operating frequency that was sustained over the hour-long stress test. We've got the average power consumption seen over the EPS 12-volt rails across that test. We've got the total system power consumption. We then, as soon as that hour-long stress test finishes, like the second it finishes, I run the 10-minute loop. So you're doing the 10-minute loop while everything's up to temperature. And then I report the 10-minute loop score. And then we've got our K-type thermocouple peak rear PCB temperature, if there's any hardware info reporting, I notify you guys of that and tell you what temperature the board claimed it was running at, peak chipset temperature, the core vids, memory error correction support. So does it support ECC? What frequency can we push the memory to? And then we've got DDR5 X1000 Expo validation. So first of all, can you just chuck DDR5 X1000 Expo memory in your system, load that Expo profile, and then we just run an hour-long stress test. Does it pass that or not? Most of the boards actually failed, so that's concerning. And if they failed, what was the maximum frequency they were stable at? Or if they passed, what was the maximum stable frequency they could go above that? So all that information is in like this one image, and then I've got all the right mark audio analyzer stuff, the boot time performance. So rather than have just graph after graph with all this information, which I have shown the graphs towards the end of the video, but that's more of an FYI, like out of interest. Like, so here's all the scorecards in a graph. So anyway, that's taken a lot of time, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. So I think that was about 6.5, almost 7,000 words, that script, which took me a day and a half to write. So, things are getting out of control when it takes you, and when I say a day, I think I spent 18 hours writing the script, which, I don't know, may sound fast or slow depending on how fast you type. I'm a relatively quick typer, but it's not just for nonstop. There's a lot of like research, checking things, double checking things, making sure the correct information's there, creating this. So I created all the scorecards while scripting the video, and there was quite a bit of stuffing around in Excel and whatnot to make those happen. So it wasn't just scripting in that time. But anyway, so I'm really happy with how that content's turning out. Balin is behind me editing that as we speak. He's probably got about 4 hours of warp stabilization work to do on that one. And it's been a big effort on Balin's behalf as well. But, I guess that's what we pay him for, just filming all the boards and stuff. It was really funny. I know getting sidetracked with this one, but we've started getting those Z890 motherboards in. I said that right, didn't I? Yeah.
Z890. Yeah.
Whenever they're new, my brain's like, you said it wrong. We've got, I think, about 30 of them, and I think we're going to get about 50 of them. So that's more than twice what we just did with X870. And why that makes Balin shudder a bit is that he has to film every single board. So, like I said, it's his job, but it becomes a bit mind-numbing. So it's the paid grind. But anyway, so I've been trying to get all of that out of the way. That video should be up the day after the podcast. So yeah, looking forward to that. I think it's going to be the best motherboard roundup we've ever done by a country mile. I've set the bar very high on this one. I don't think we'll be able to do anywhere near the degree of testing for Z890, because the problem is like the memory validation alone, some of the boards was 6 hours of memory validation because it's only an hour-long stress test. But you obviously have to do the initial test with the Expo profile loaded at 8,000, and it might crash after 45 minutes. And you're like, okay. So then you try 7,800, 7,600, 7,400, and you could start at 7,400, but if it passes that, then you've got to go to 76 anyway. So there's really no shortcuts with this testing. So yeah, some boards had multiple failures before we got a pass, and then some boards passed multiple times before we got a failure. So I think the average time spent testing memory stability would have been about 4 hours per board, which turns it into kind of like a day. It's basically a day, an entire day it takes to test all the things we test on the boards, which is why it's taken a little over a month to get 20 boards done. But yeah, so anyway, what was your question, Tim?
Well, I'm just wondering, like, you said you put X870E and X870 into the same video. What do you make of the differences between those two chipsets now that it's more than what you got when you were testing like X670E versus X670?
Like you said in your video, it's a mess. I don't really know how the average consumer is meant to work it out, because honestly, I can't even work it out. Like, I tested all the 20 boards, and I'm like, at what point? Because personally, well, okay, so I guess to answer this one, I would just buy a B650 board. That's just how I would go about, which is my recommendation in the video, but people don't necessarily listen to everything I say or anything that I say, but they're happy to watch the content. But yeah, I recommend getting a B650 or B650E board. There's some good value B650E boards. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't even know at what point there's a crossover to where it makes sense to go with one of the higher end boards, which sounds absurd because it's kind of my job and I've tested so many boards, but it's so dynamic between brands and then the prices are always moving. So, and they vary in regions. So it's really difficult if you were to do an entire AM5 board analysis top down, or at least be in X series boards. I don't know what the conclusion would be. And I'm not even sure you could come to a conclusion. It's really just about getting a board with the features you want and trying to get those features at the best price possible. But it's just, it's a mess. But yeah, obviously, I mean, I don't really know what to say other than it's a mess, somewhat anti-consumer, and we don't like to see it. But also, we've set our piece on that. Now people want to know which boards to buy and are there any that should be avoided, which is why I just tested them all. And
yeah,
it really is what it is at that point. It's kind of like a $1,600 RTX 4090. We wish it was cheaper. It ain't going to be cheaper. It is what it is. It's a mighty powerful graphics card. The price is the price, and it's probably only going to get worse, but it's out of our hands. I remember when this stuff started, like the price creep started what was it, like 7 or 8 years ago? I mean, it's always been a thing, but let's say it was became a little bit more rapid, accelerated a little bit more, and so many people blamed reviewers. This is 100%. This is entirely the reviewers' fault. Yeah, we cop the full blame because they've okayed this. They've said the products are really impressive in terms of performance or whatever, and they've normalized this behavior. It's all on them, the reviewers. It's like, okay, calm down, buddy. At the end of the day, it's like we're not super happy about these motherboards being expensive. I'd rather you could get yourself a good quality AM5 motherboard with all the bells and whistles for like $100, but it's out of my hands. And we complained about the graphics card thing, and you can only complain about it for so long. Look, we'll still beat that drum for the low end and mid range. I think if you're getting a $400 8GB graphics card next generation, we'll be banging on about that. But if the 5090 ends up being $2,000 or whatever, we're just like, here's how it performs.
Yeah, and I think with motherboards, like, at least for a lot of gamers, like people, everyday consumers that are going to be buying those boards, you can get pretty much all the features that you need on an entry-level B650 motherboard.
That's right.
You're going to be missing out on a few things that you might like to have. Like there might be a board with Wi-Fi and one without Wi-Fi in the cheap tier. But it's kind of unlike a graphics card where you're forced into buying like the 8GB GPUs if you want something that's $300. Like there's very little choice in terms of trying to avoid that issue. Whereas with motherboards, you're not really going to be limited in performance all that much. If you buy a $120 or $130 motherboard, you're going to be getting enough M.2 slots. You'll be getting a couple of PCIe slots, and yeah, there might be PCI 4.0 instead of 5.0, but it's still going to be adequate for most people who are going to be using it for gaming. You're going to get enough USB ports, or at least a reasonable amount of USB ports on most of those boards. And then, yeah, the higher tier stuff is really for people kind of like me with my workstation. Like I've got an AM5 workstation. I would not consider a B series board because it doesn't have enough PCIe lanes, not enough M.2 slots that I need, not enough USB, at least high speed USB. And you can really only get that on the X series boards. But that's like a niche use case. Like I've got a 7950X. Most gamers are probably not buying that CPU and could easily get away with B650. So I feel it is a little better than as much as we would love the motherboards to be even cheaper than they are. At least you're not getting rolled when you buy like a $120 motherboard versus a $500 motherboard.
Yeah, that's right.
It's still pretty good.
Yeah, I know people like to complain about the motherboard pricing thing and things getting more expensive. There's plenty to complain about there, I suppose. But there's a bit more nuance to that as well. Like, I don't think it's as bad as what people make out. So I'm just having a look now. It's pretty much been the situation for over a year now. You can buy yourself a good B650 motherboard for about $120, which is the price point you gave. And people, but they used to be $80. There's a couple of things there. First of all, the $80 B450 motherboards and the boards that they were crap. Let's be honest. Half of them had naked VRMs. They were terrible boards. You shouldn't have bought them. And if you want a crap board, just buy an A620 or something like that. So first of all, you're comparing apples to oranges because something like an ASRock B650M Pro RS, that'll run a 7950X with ease, like 170 watt TDP part, no dramas, will run it full load all day, every day. You weren't able to do that on a lot of those cheap sub $100 motherboards of the past. That, the A620 is filling the role of anyway. And then you've got inflation is a thing. We can't expect to have $80 motherboards at the entry level for the next 20 years. It's just not how money works. So I think $120, $130 US for a good quality board that can quite literally run anything you throw on it at 100% of its output, maximum performance, then that's pretty reasonable. Especially, like we know for a fact that DDR5 memory is more costly to implement on the motherboard side. PCI Express 5.0, again, more costly to implement than PCIe 4.0. So there are some factors there that have driven motherboard prices up alongside inflation. Yeah. So they're just more capable, more powerful products. But yeah, as you say, it's nowhere near as you're nowhere near as limited as you are on the GPU front. You kind of, your hands are tied on that one.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back and have a look at like a B450 Tomahawk that we recommended quite a lot back in 2018 or whatever it was, like that was about $100 when it came out, which just based on inflation back in 2018, 2019, you're looking at about $125 now. Yep. Based on, and some people say that, the inflation numbers are BS or whatever, but it's just using an inflation calculator.
Well, there's some inflation, right? It's not
there
nothing.
Is some inflation.
It's just how it works.
And, also it was a fairly basic product. Like if you just look at it visually, on the rear I/O panel, you were getting, I'm just having a look now, like 5 USB ports and a USB-C, Ethernet, audio. I think there was a DVI port on it, which is not seen on modern motherboards, and HDMI. The ASRock B650M Pro RS that you were just talking about, it comes with Wi-Fi as an inclusion. So, and that's for $140 US on Newegg right now. So just adding Wi-Fi to the B650, to the B450 Tomahawk probably would have put it into this price range. It's got more USB ports. I think it's got 8 USB ports, 2.5 gig Ethernet on it, and obviously all the additional connectivity that you just get from the newer boards. So if you were going to go back to a B450 Tomahawk and even just add in Wi-Fi and a couple more USB ports, the pricing is probably not that different after factoring in inflation to what you'd see from an entry-level motherboard today. Of course, people will go like, it's $140 now. They used to be $100 or below $100. It's not great to see that number difference, but at least these boards are not like trash tier entry-level naked VRMs, as you were saying, like no USB, no Wi-Fi. Just physically, the ASRock entry-level board looks better than the B650 in terms of like the components and stuff that are being used, more modern design elements and bigger heat sinks and those sorts of things. And those all add up a little bit. So, yeah.
Yeah, the discrete MOSFETs, the power configurations on those cheaper boards were so bad. Like every aspect of the power delivery was just ultra trash tier. And it's kind of like an ignorance is bliss type situation. It's like, well, I put a mid-range Ryzen 5 on there and it ran fine. It's like, yeah, okay, it probably did. But that's what you were limited to. So, and those cheaper boards still exist. I mean, I know, a A620 is pretty crap. I wouldn't recommend anyone get them. They are, in my opinion, they're probably a bit overpriced, but it's kind of like the trash tier boards that you shouldn't be buying aren't as good value as they once were. How useful is that? You know what I mean? Like, it's like people but you used to be able to get the A620 equivalents. They're $90 now. They used to be maybe $60. So they've gone up $30. How much you can attribute inflation to that? Whatever. You can argue about that. But the point is you shouldn't have been buying those boards anyway. You should have been getting the $100 B450 Tomahawk, because that was probably the Tomahawk was as trash as you wanted to go, if you know what I mean. Like, it was an
Mm.
excellent board. It was a great value board, and it was a perfectly fine board, but it was also as entry level as you wanted to go for that generation. So $100 was essentially the entry level.
Yeah, and related to this topic, as we're talking a little bit about AM4 here, is that the 5800 XUD has finally reached end of life status, which I think has been a little bit coming now. That said, they have replaced it with the 5700 XUD, so not sure how long that part will be still in the market for. But yeah, Computer Base was reporting that the 5800 XUD has pretty much disappeared from European retailers, at least the retailers that they were checking. I had a look here in Australia. You really can't find it anymore and haven't been able to for at least a little while at, places like PC, Kskew. And yeah, Newegg, you can't really get them anymore either. So it's kind of, one of the best CPUs that we've seen for quite some time is now finally filtering its way out of the market. And I don't know, is that potentially to encourage people to make the shift, move up to AM5, prepare some room for newer X3D parts?
Yeah, not sure. Well, actually, this just in, I've just come across a leak, Tim, that I'm going to break on the Hardware Unboxed podcast.
Yes.
Within the next 3 weeks, I've heard word that AMD is going to release the 5800 XT3D.
Oh, no.
I'd love it if they did that. That would be the best meme CPU ever. It is a bit weird, though, axing the 5800 X3D after they announced those XT CPUs, which was obviously to clear out bin silicon, like we know what they're all about. But it's pretty funny with AMD making it that, AM4's going strong. It's continuing on. We're continuing to support it. We're continuing to make CPUs for it. And then shortly after making a big hoo-ha about that, they're like, well, the 5800 X3Ds, that's donezo.
The best CPU that everyone wants and buys. Just buy the slightly slower one, thanks, that will sell you for about $200 or whatever it is.
Yeah, which is honestly, it's a better, the 5700 X3D is what you should have been buying anyway for quite a while now, because substantially better value. But I mean, by the next Hardware Unboxed podcast, that one could be donezo as well. I don't know how much inventory they have for that particular part. But it makes sense. Like we've been saying for a long time now, unless you're already on AM4, there's no point buying AM4, apart from like the most entry level. If you for some reason want to buy or build a new PC using new PC parts and you want to do it as while spending as little money as possible, then AM4 is a viable option. But realistically, buying a 5800 X3D new, if you're not already on AM4, has not made sense for over a year, because you would just buy a Ryzen 5 7600 or Ryzen 7 7700. They're typically have been similar or better in terms of pricing for similar or better performance. And as newer games start to leverage the bandwidth of DDR5, they've continued to pull further and further ahead. I imagine as good as the 5800 X3D is, if we revisit this topic in like 6 years from now, the 5800 X3D will probably be getting pretty murdered by like a Ryzen 7 7700. I imagine that CPU will age much better. As we talked about on last week's podcast, comparing the various generations of Intel CPUs, the move from DDR3 to DDR4 wasn't big at the time, but now you're seeing like a 30% difference for games. So eventually that bandwidth becomes utilized and necessary.
Yeah, and I think what we see with the 5800 X3D is that it is it was released in early 2022, so the CPU is not going to be around forever. And I think it'd be pretty unusual for a company to sell 3 generations of flagship CPU at the same time, because the 7800 X3D, I guess they're trying to phase it out of the market, 5800 X3D, and then the 9800 X3D, which apparently is coming like in the next couple of weeks. It'd be pretty unusual. Like it's pretty common for parts to eventually phase out. And even when we were in the AM4 generation, like you pretty much couldn't buy like the 1800X, 1700X by the time the 5000 series was coming around. Like most of the lower tier, the older stuff for people that wanted those affordable options, that was like your Zen 2 or even Zen Plus era processors, and they were very cheap. And AMD would only offer the value choices, because I guess they're understanding that when a 5800 XGD was available, it was like $300 plus. There's going to be a lot of people switching over and deciding, well, I'll just buy a Ryzen 5 7600, which offers relatively similar performance. It's like $200. Can buy a motherboard for about the same price as just the 5800 X3D. At that point, it kind of doesn't make sense to sell that part anymore, especially when you've got the 5700 X3D still around. But yeah, I mean, there's going to become a point when AM4 is going to be discontinued, as much as that was a fantastic generation for everyone and continues to be a solid choice if you're, to buy the CPU if you're already on AM4. The end comes for everything. And when we're 2 generations into AM5 and yeah, we haven't really gotten a new architecture or new parts on AM4 for a while now, it's always going to happen. It's always going to make sense. But it has lasted a long time. And how often do you see with our videos just the demand for 5800 X3D content is still through the roof? Even in this computer-based poll, they just put a poll on the article saying, do you own a Ryzen 7 5800 X3D? And 34% of people said that they did, which is huge for just one single CPU.
Well, it was the CPU for a long time. It really was. Like, even back in the day, it was delivering 12900K light performance. I think generally just beating the 12900K, especially when that CPU was paired with DDR4 memory. But it was a lot cheaper and significantly more power efficient and didn't require expensive memory to get the most out of. You could basically stick any memory in there and it worked pretty damn well. So it's the GOAT for a reason, I guess. But it was also, I don't know if we give AMD credit for this. I never know whether to credit AMD or it was a happy accident, but it was a pretty good strategy to get them back in command, or I don't know if back in command's the right word, because I don't know if they ever were in command, but dominant in terms of CPU sales, having flooded the industry with multiple good options. Even if it did sort of cut their own lunch, cut into the sales of the newer stuff, it was still a win for AMD. If you weren't buying their new stuff, you were buying their older stuff. And it was hard for Intel to get a look in that period of time because there was just so many great options on AM4 and AM5. So in that sense, it was a really good strategy. But I think now that they've, I don't know, would you say essentially won that war? They certainly have on the retail front, right? They're still outselling Intel heavily as in retail desktop usage. Whether they're walking that back now because they've sort of seen the pain that really good value Zen 4 has created for Zen 5. I mean, that was largely because Zen 5 didn't really deliver much as well. But they obviously want to sell Zen 5 to you. So they could be changing tactic.
Yeah, I guess they're in an interesting position with that particular generation because I guess back with AM4, as you say, like Zen 3, even if it was the non-X3D parts, were still quite a bit faster than the Zen 2 products. So whether you're buying like a 5700 or whatever, or 5600, you were still getting a pretty good buy. But yeah, I think AMD's, and a lot of companies are learning that when you release a new generation, you kind of want to, I guess, optimize the amount of inventory that's available for older parts so that if there are parts that are going to be in that sort of price range or in that sort of performance category, you don't want to have like the part you've just made and then the very similar part that's way cheaper and that you would just buy that instead. So I think, yeah, around the 5000 series, they were probably just going for the let's make everything we possibly can. And they made loads of those 5000 series CPUs. And I remember around the time of the 5000 series, you could buy like a Ryzen 5 3600 for like $120 or something. Like
I think
they
were
were
like 105. It was insane.
Yeah, they were outrageously cheap. And that's obviously because they produced a boatload of those CPUs, then followed up with a great generation that they then made a boatload of those as well. Whereas with the 5000 series, they're stretching it out a little bit as well. They're taking a bit longer to get those non-X models out so that you're more incentivized to buy the higher tier stuff. We've seen with the 7800 X3D, they've been trying to make that more expensive and less available to obviously make room for the 9800 X3D. And these are things that I guess a dominant player does in the market. When they're in that position, there's a few more optimizations that you do to get the margins that you want, to get the sales that you want. Whereas back when the 5800 X3D was launched, Intel was still quite a popular option for buyers. Like people were buying 12th gen CPUs and upgrading to them. Obviously, there was a lot of people still on products like 8700Ks, 9900Ks in that era, still very popular. And it was only once we saw the 5800 X3D, that's the part that, in my opinion at least, turned the tide for AMD. People really saw the value from the AM4 generation. People who'd bought those affordable lower tier CPUs suddenly had this option they could go to, and that really justified the whole platform. And that's when things started to explode for AMD. And it started to happen, I guess, a little bit with other 5000 series parts, but it was those models that really put the screws in. Whereas obviously we're in a very different situation right now. And I wouldn't say that like there's no good value AM5 CPUs. Like I still feel that the Ryzen 5 7600 is in a pretty good position, but we haven't seen like the market flooded with $120, $130 or whatever the equivalent is today after inflation or whatever. We haven't seen as much of that. And obviously the upgrade path is still questionable on AM5 because Zen 5 hasn't really given us much. Speaking of 9800 X3D, MSI last week, I think probably just after we did this podcast, has somehow managed to leak 9800 X3D performance or 9000 X3D performance, which I guess they pretty clearly referring to when they say 16-core Ryzen 9000 X3Ds in their slides. Wonder what that could be. 8-core Ryzen 9000 X3D. But this is kind of, I don't know if you've seen the slides, but it hasn't really shown us all that much. Like, obviously, this was a very popular story that blew up a little bit. But, I mean, it hasn't really revealed too much that we weren't expecting. Like, I think they've shown between 2 and 13% more performance for the new parts for gaming performance and like a little faster for the other workloads. And they've shown like 2 benchmarks or 3 benchmarks for some of these things. Not overly enlightening, would you say?
No, like, yeah, but based on our initial sort of findings with, say, a 9700X, I expected that the 9800X3D would only be a few percent faster than the 7800X3D on average, but there were other things like clock frequency and stuff like that that we had to consider. So it's what we would have initially expected. I don't know how accurate it is because manufacturers just can't run gaming benchmarks. That's what we've worked out from AMD, and we've seen it time and time again. First of all, Black Myth Wukong is a terrible CPU benchmark. It also looks like they've probably got every single bell and whistle in terms of the GPU department turned on because they're at 60 FPS.
And it's a 1080p, so they must be using like very high. Oh, even then, would a 4090 even do 60 FPS at 1080p with very high ray tracing? It seems low.
Well, you wouldn't have DLSS and stuff enabled probably.
Yeah, okay, that's fair.
So that seems about right to me. But they're probably using the benchmark tool, which uses about 2% of an X3D CPU. So getting a 1 FPS difference there, I would have expected the frame rate to be identical. but sure, 1 FPS, that's... But yeah, Black Myth Wukong, not a good game to test CPU performance with, period. And the benchmark tool, which they're almost certainly using because manufacturers just use basic tools, is an awful CPU benchmark. Shadow of the Tomb Raider, really good CPU benchmark still, but looking at the frame rates they're getting and the small difference between the CPUs, I can almost guarantee you that they're using the built-in benchmark, which is primarily a GPU benchmark and doesn't really measure CPU performance for about 90% of the benchmark pass. So if you were to test in game in like the village section we use, you'd probably see a bigger margin than 2% there. But again, that's just, we'll have to wait and see. And then Far Cry 6, the built-in benchmark on that one is actually relatively CPU demanding. And we've seen that it can be a little bit more favorable to the Zen 5 architecture relative to other games. So 13% there probably makes sense. But it wouldn't, those figures wouldn't necessarily lead me to believe it's a 10% faster uplift on average, which would be nice if that is the case. I have no idea at this point in time. But based on those numbers, which is very little to go on, I'd be guessing around 6%. But it's about as good as a shot in the dark, to be perfectly honest. But what I will say is, far out, the MSI and AMD relationship, it's got to be at an all-time high. Like, we know there's something going on there. We know there's something going on there. They're not friendly. They're not friends. They're not on the best terms. And then for MSI to go and leak any numbers, whether they're accurate or not, is just not a good look. I'm sure there would have been some words there with AMD. I'm pretty confident AMD will be massively pissed off about this. Yeah.
Well, it's not unusual that we've seen board vendors do these sorts of presentations relating to their motherboards and things, because usually the reason why they show these slides is that it's always a preface for overclocking functionality on motherboards or something like that. So they always show like, oh, this is what the boards will do stock with our 9,000 XUD parts, and then they'll move. I don't know whether this is the case in this presentation because I'm only looking at the slides for the stock performance. But normally then it would go into, this is all our features on our motherboard. This is what you'll get from these parts. This is what the performance you can expect. And I think I've seen Asus, Gigabyte, MSI at some point for various different generations do this. But yeah, like if people are wondering why we're saying MSI and AMD's relationship at the moment is questionable, is obviously because there's been a few things that have been interesting with that. The discontinuation of RDNA 3 products. I don't think they made a 7700 XT or 7800 XT, did they?
Something along. Yeah, they announced a couple of RDNA 3 products. They turned up really late, and then they got pulled off the market. So it varied for a few different models as the relationship probably soured over that period. But yeah, very odd. Very odd. Sorry, if you have something else to say to that?
No, not really. Yeah, but I was just remembering, the XTX model, when that was announced, they took like 3 months, I think, to get their
really
product
weird
onto the market, whereas all the other brands had theirs available at launch. And I think it was even the case that AMD didn't put MSI in their launch slide, like their partner slide. Like they had all the usual brands like your Sapphires and Power Colors and Asus, Gigabyte, and MSI wasn't. And I think I remember asking them something about that at the time, and AMD was just like, yeah, whatever, like, they won't have cards at launch or something, but they're still a partner or whatever, the usual PR stuff. So
yeah, there was plenty of early warning signs. There's even a bit of weirdness, let's say, around RDNA 2, where products would get announced and then MSI would be much later to market, or they'd have like 1 or 2 products, whereas their competitors had multiple. And we got like the mech lineup, and they started doing different models for AMD cards, very reminiscent of what the GeForce Partner Program was meant to be, really. It seemed like MSI had signed up for that. So let's do some speculation, Tim. Let's do it. Let's do.
I know you love speculation.
I don't love speculating about the performance or the things that I review. I like to not do that and just stick to the facts and figures once we acquire them. But this is irrelevant, really. We don't review the companies. We don't care about the companies. We really just care about the products. But we are speculating here. We don't have too much information to go on. AMD and MSI have been very tight-lipped about this situation. The most I've got is it's a very sensitive situation. That's the most I've really got out of either of the brands. So take from that what you will. But I have a theory. I don't know if you want to hear that, Tim, or do you have a theory?
No, go with your theory first. I'm interested to hear your theory.
Well, my theory is wild speculation, not founded on a whole lot, and I have no real evidence. So I just want to make that perfectly clear before someone jumps up and down and carries on in the comment section, if you're listening to this on YouTube. I think that MSI was one of the few brands that went along with the GeForce Partner Program. I think they either signed up for that or they played ball with NVIDIA. And I think AMD were well aware of that fact and were not happy about it. And we're probably telling them, they have to support their products better and whatnot, and they didn't. And I think it's a situation where AMD has probably cut MSI off largely. Or there was just a a mutual tiff. They both kind of cracked it with one another. But I think it's something to do with that, because we saw, and I'm just connecting the dots of what we, the evidence, I suppose, that we do have, where MSI released many more GeForce graphics cards, fewer Radeon cards, which you can just say, well, that's because GeForce sells better, so why would they bubble? Okay, fine, whatever. But they also removed the Radeon brand from a lot of their sub-brands. Like I said, we got the Mech, and it wasn't really heavily promoted or advertised. It was, and they were kind of like crappy-looking Ventus cards, I suppose. Anyway, so that all sort of took place initially, and then there was a small lag period where this all came to light, and AMD started removing MSI from, partner slides, and the Radeon lineup for MSI continued to dwindle. But then we also started to see, and especially more recently, that the motherboard support started to fall away as well. So there is only three X870 motherboards in existence right now from MSI, whereas there's about 9, I think it is, from Asus, similar from Gigabyte, and there's probably 3 times more from ASRock as well. So it's weird when ASRock is making 3 times more boards, different models, when compared to MSI, given MSI is a much bigger partner, or should be, a much bigger company. And this is their technically latest and greatest platform. It's not a complete rebrand, which obviously it is. So I don't know. All those factors, to me, suggest that that's going on. I think it's probably AMD who cracked it with MSI. But
yeah, it's an interesting theory, and I think that the thing that would lead me to believe that, or at least, again, speculation purposes, is that you would want to have AM5 motherboards. Whereas I think on the graphic side of things, like a fairly easy dismissal of all that stuff is, well, Radeon cards just don't sell. So there's no point from a major manufacturer like MSI investing in RDNA 3 products, because they've run the numbers internally or whatever, and they've come back and it's a low number, and they're getting outsold by Power Color and Sapphire and all those brands. And, we've heard from major OEMs that do produce both NVIDIA and AMD graphics cards, what their internal split is between NVIDIA and AMD. And let's just say the NVIDIA number is approaching 100%. Like, it's very high relative to AMD. However, you would want to have more than 3 X870 motherboards, I think. I think that when you're on the dominant platform, and while Zen 5 is disappointing, people are still buying AMD processors in the droves relative to Intel. And I guess we've heard again from partners that Intel is still popular on the desktop market in some markets, particularly regions like China and Korea, where Intel it has lagged behind, I guess, Europe and America in terms of market share. So in those regions, it's more 50-50 at times, at least now. Whereas if you see in North America, it's like 80% AMD to 20% Intel, or even a higher margin. But you'd still want more than 3 AMD motherboards, I think. So, and then a further issue that I see, and something that I found very weird on the mobile side, was the MSI Claw. So if you're not aware of this product, it's a handheld gaming device similar to Asus's ROG Ally and the Steam Deck. Yet for some reason, MSI made this with an Intel CPU, even though it has been, at least since then and pretty much at the time as well, widely shown that AMD's APUs were much better choices for this sort of product, which is why everyone else was using AMD APUs. So the Steam Deck has one, the ROG Ally, there's a Lenovo one, and all the smaller brands that create their own sort of devices. All of those are basically using AMD APUs, and yet this MSI Claw product, which was widely panned in reviews, like no one thought this was a good product. It was not competitive in terms of battery life and performance with the AMD products. MSI made this weird Intel collaboration, and I think that if they had their time again, they would want to have made this an AMD product. Whether or not that's a partnership with Intel specifically that they've worked on to sort of poo-poo AMD, whether AMD's gone, we're just not supplying you with the APUs that you want. it's hard to say there, but that's again a very suspicious product that sort of shows like the lack of a relationship at the moment between MSI and AMD.
Yeah, that's right. You can speculate as to why and what's happened, but I think what's more concrete, certainly beyond speculation, is the fact that there's a problem. Like MSI, AMD not working together as well as they were, and as time goes on, it seems to be breaking down further, where there's less and less collaboration between these two companies, less products. I mean, like I said, it's pretty shocking that only 4 X870 boards were announced and only 3 of them exist to this day. So yeah, that's weird.
Yeah, and it's weird because MSI had some of the most popular AM4 motherboards. Like they were very, very popular throughout that series.
It's weird because do you know what motherboard manufacturers like to make a lot of?
Money?
Oh yeah, that's right. The other M. Yeah, I suppose you got me there, money. But all right, I'll be more specific with my line of questioning. How do motherboard manufacturers like to make a lot of money selling your shit motherboards? No, yeah, generally they like to make a lot of motherboards and sell a lot of motherboards. And the way of going about that is, well, to make a lot of motherboards, hopefully make them good, make them attractive, and then they sell. The way not to do that is to make just a couple of motherboards that are kind of competitive, not super competitive. Like they've probably got one of their X870 motherboards is genuinely competitive, and that's the Carbon, which is absurdly expensive, and you probably, in my opinion, you shouldn't buy it. It's a amazing motherboard. Like if I had my choice of AM5 motherboards, that would be at the top of my list or very close to. So it's a fantastic board, but I think it's $450 US, something like that. But their entry-level board is a bit odd. It's only got a single USB port, not super competitive. It does have some nice features, but yeah, just a bit weird. But anyway, yeah, motherboard manufacturer not making many motherboards for what is arguably the most successful platform right now, with AM4 going out the door. And MSI, as you said, had so much success with AM4. I think they're probably one of the most successful companies for that generation. So had to have made some of that money there.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Obviously, we're unlikely to get any concrete answers into what's happened there, but we'll just have to keep, I guess, tracking to see what's happening. Like once B850 motherboards come out, what are we looking at there? What's the lineups looking at for each of those brands? What are we looking like with RDNA 4? I think I don't think MSI will make an RDNA 4 GPU. At the moment, I looked on their website, they're only listing 6800 XTs is the only AMD Radeon GPU currently listed on that MSI website. And we know that they've made 7900 XT X's and stuff because I've got one. So they did make one. So
yeah, it's such a weird decision as well, because I know we've already talked about, the sales and all that sort of stuff, but we've seen multiple examples over the last 6 years where every single Radeon GPU you could get your hand on, you could sell, and for a good price. And there was, whether they were accurate or not, there was examples of MSI trying to sell GPUs for more than the MSRP, that they walked back and, that shouldn't have happened, or, we'll correct that type thing. So they were making bank. Like MSI has made a lot of profit on Radeon GPUs, especially during those boom periods, cryptocurrency mining and, probably less
the previous
so AI,
and
cryptocurrency
the previous mining,
cryptocurrency. Yeah, that's right. There's been like 3 of those booms where they've made bank really, and Radeon GPUs have been more desirable than GeForce GPUs in a lot of instances, and they've sold for just insane money. So who's to say there won't be another boom in a year or two from now where you could sell every single Radeon GPU you can get your hands on for the MSRP or top dollar, like a premium, within reason, not going to scalping territory, but that seems like it could happen. So to limit your supply of valuable GPUs doesn't seem like a smart move. But anyway, as you say, we're speculating. We don't really know why it's happened. We just know what's happening.
Yeah, I think it's smart for companies to diversify their product lines and just hedge their bets a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Like even if a brand tells us, yeah, so our market share from AMD is about 10% versus 90% for Nvidia, that could change at a moment's notice. And things like, I guess I don't necessarily mean it could change drastically at a moment's notice, but companies in each generation can turn things around and turn the boat in one direction from, as we've seen from CPUs. AMD was nowhere with CPUs, and then within a couple of generations, their CPUs were highly attractive. And if you just completely delete your presence in the market, trying to get that relationship back up and running once the products get better is going to be more difficult than if you just maintained a product line throughout that period. And as well, a lot of companies, and this is something that we see a lot with leaks, or at least leaks getting these things wrong, board partners do not get pricing information for upcoming products until either at the time that they're announced or shortly before. So when companies are having to think about, are we making RDNA 4 products or not, they may see the performance targets or things, or they know the power delivery specs and cooling specs that they're going to have to produce for their cards. They're not going to know how good the product is until basically the last minute. So if AMD pulls out a big surprise and, suddenly RDNA 4 is exceptionally good value, like these products are amazingly cheap, and then a company has just completely deleted their presence because they thought, no one buys Radeon, and this card wasn't looking that good when we got the specifications or whatever. But if AMD suddenly makes that a $200 GPU, then everyone's going to be wanting to get on board with that. Not that I'm saying that's likely to happen or anything, but that's why I think companies like Asus and Gigabyte are sticking around with Radeon, because they want to make sure that they're still in there. Same as why they would stick around with Intel through AMD selling quite well for desktop products. You want to have both product lines. And even back then, when AMD was producing terrible bulldozer CPUs, you would see motherboards from all the brands supporting them, even though I guess there was a few people buying them, but they were not well received. People were not flooding out to get AM3 motherboards.
There was definitely fewer boards for sure, and that's sort of always been the case. So that makes sense, but deleting entire product lines, but there's more to it anyway. Like there's clearly something going on, because we've pointed to multiple examples where things have gone the way you wouldn't have expected them to. So as you say, we'll just monitor that situation and see what happens. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter if they're not making the products, then they're not making the products, and we don't have to review them. They're not relevant. And MSI certainly doesn't have to make AMD products, and I suppose AMD doesn't have to allow them to be a partner.
That's right.
It's weird after all this time, I suppose.
Yeah. I think we should be clear that we're not suggesting that all partners should be forced to make all of the products. That's certainly not the case. And as you say, it makes sense when NVIDIA, for example, in GPUs is the dominant brand and AMD is not, that you would see 20 different GeForce products available, but then only one or two Radeon products. Like that would make sense. But it's pretty rare that we see it go to this degree, at least what MSI is doing at the moment. And certainly if they want to choose to make products or not, they're well within their rights to do so. But I think there is a bit more to that story. But anyway, we'll take a break. We'll come back and talk about our boring lives. We're back, Steve. Boring lifetime. And I'm going to guess that you have just been testing motherboards and CPUs.
Largely true. I'm going to tell a work-related story anyway. I'm going to ruin the segment. But no, over the weekend, it was my wife's uncle's 60th birthday, and the family decided to come out to our place because, we've got a rather large property and the weather was good. So we did a big barbecue and stuff. And
nice.
A lot of the family stayed all weekend. So I actually got a break from work, probably at a time that I didn't necessarily want one, but it was probably good for me to be made not to work for a couple of days. So I jumped in really fresh on Monday morning first thing and finished up that motherboard content that I've already talked about. Well, I didn't finish that probably a few days later, but you know what I mean. So that was good. So rested, enjoyed it, good weather, good barbecue, bit of a surf and turf event, which I always love. So that was good. So that's the boring life stuff for me, really. I think that's everything. And now, as I said, I'm going to spoil the segment with some work-related stuff that I wanted to quickly make mention of, because I'm updating all of the CPU results, which is really what my boring life has been over the last few weeks.
Right, yep.
And this morning, I've just started updating the 12th gen stuff. So I've done the 14th gen, skipped to the 13th gen because 13th gen and 14th gen are the same thing. So there's no point cluttering up the graphs with the same CPUs. And latest BIOS revisions, 24H2, all of that stuff, chipset drivers, everything updated, and did my benchmarking. And for the most part, we saw pretty good gains on 14th gen for a lot of the games, like we did with, at least similar performance to what we're seeing before, generally a little bit better. So that's all good. Tested as expected. That's with the new power profile. So extreme for the 1400K and then performance for the 14700K and 14600K. That's how the Asus BIOS with the absolute latest microcode firmware, the whole lot. That's what they do. So that's fine. Chucked in the 12th gen CPUs, did a fresh install of Windows, reconfigured everything again, did all the necessary installs and started testing. And I've noticed that a lot of the games have dropped about 10 FPS, which is like a 6 to 7% performance reduction. So it's like, that's odd. I'm like, so this was yesterday, wasted a lot of time, tested about half a dozen games and found much the same across all of them. Double checked memory timings and the memory configuration. That was all correct. Checked power. I actually just power unlimited them and it didn't really change the performance. So
that's weird.
The 1200K was defaulting to extreme. So at this point, I don't know if it's 24H2 that's to blame, or if it's the latest BIOS revision. And that's something I can quickly and easily test, and I'm about to test after this podcast. I'll roll back to sort of the pre-fixing of the stability problem BIOSes, essentially pretty close to the BIOS I would have tested with previously, and see if that restores the missing 6 to 7% performance that I'm seeing. Which doesn't sound like a huge number, but it can be quite substantial performance reduction, especially in...
That's weird for updates. Like, you wouldn't expect any performance reduction.
That's right. I was expecting 12th gen to hit pretty much the exact same numbers. A lot of these benchmarks are really reliable, highly repetitive, should be about the same. It's not. It's about 7-ish% lower across the board. So not sure yet what's to blame for that, but now it's an investigation that I have to do while I'm trying to, get underway with Arrow Lake testing.
Fun stuff for you.
Yeah, so I'll start with the older BIOS revision and see if that solves it. If it doesn't, I'm going to ask around some other reviewers and see if they're updating their data or if they're just sticking with the old 12th gen data. I'm not sure. I have to find that out. And then maybe I have to install 23H2 and see if that solves the problem, which I'm going to waste a fair bit of time doing that. But I've got almost a week up my sleeve. So let's hope by the weekend I've got to the bottom of this old CPU that's sort of not super relevant, but a lot of people are going to want to see 12th gen performance in that video. And that, they are relevant in the sense that people own them and whatnot. So anyway, that's a bit of fun in my boring life. There you go, Tim.
Yeah, well, I'm interested to see how that goes with that investigation because, that's pretty unexpected. And there could be any number of things that are the cause of that. So hopefully it doesn't take you too long to get to the bottom of that. And I think it's a pretty relevant CPU. I think a lot of people will be interested to see, if you were a first-gen buyer on LGA 1700 with 12th gen and then you're thinking about upgrading, obviously you've got a choice between AM5 and Arrow Lake. So you're probably going to want to make sure that the performance that's been shown there is accurate. But then again, if people haven't updated, there's always that difficult one, right? Like if people who currently own that CPU are not seeing that performance because they haven't updated to whatever the issue relating BIOS or Windows update is, then anyway, a bit of a mess there. So I'm sure you'll get to the bottom of it.
Yep.
But out my way, not all that much has been happening, to be fair. The weather has been great. So getting outside, doing a few things, getting my veggie garden up to scratch and growing a lot of things. So it's been nice to get all that stuff going, testing out the automated watering system properly now that it's needed. So that's been going well, and just constantly continuing my battle with ants and aphids on the trees, getting getting the population down over time through some targeted battling on those things. So,
mate, if you're having trouble with the ants, you got to get these granules I've got. They are next level. We had a lot of little ants that come in the house and stuff, and we've basically struggled to try and keep them out. And there's a lot of them. Anyway, I sprinkled just a little bit on the ant trail, all gone. After a day, like one day, the next day, all gone.
Yeah, they're like little nuclear bombs. Is that what you're saying? For the ant nests?
I nuked them hard.
Yeah.
Almost felt bad about it, but, you know.
Yeah, well, if they're a pest, then that's what it is. Yeah, well, the ant problem, to be fair, is largely resolved. It's more the aphids at the moment, but that's going okay. It's going okay. Winning the war, I think, on that one, so that's good.
I'm not sure there's aphid granules, but I'll look into it for you.
Well, they largely just stay on the tree, so they don't like have a trail or anything or a little nest, as far as I know. So
you just spray them.
Yep, just water. It's been going quite well. Just blasting them off the tree, and then they just, I guess, they die from the water pressure. I guess. But yeah, apart from that, not a whole lot has been happening. I did watch. What was it? Deadpool versus Wolverine. Is that the latest Deadpool? Is it Deadpool versus Wolverine. Oh, I quite enjoyed that, so that was good.
Okay, cool. I haven't watched that yet, but I plan to.
You haven't watched it? Yeah, okay. I'd recommend it. I think it's quite fun. I think it came out on like digital platforms or whatever recently, which is why I watched it, and yeah, I quite enjoyed it. I think as far as like, again, we always come back to the superhero and us being like, I guess, fatigued by the crappy releases that they keep going with. But I've enjoyed the Deadpool movies, and this one was pretty good as well. So I enjoyed that. But apart from that, yeah, pretty much not too much else to say. Obviously, I've been working on some videos and stuff that you'll see on the channel soon. And yeah, not much else is going on really. I won't be around next week because I'll be over in Perth in Australia. Little break for a couple of days, so no podcast next week, but we'll come back probably earlier the following week to talk about Arrow Lake and all that sort of thing, the new performance-related stuff, and potentially there'll be a 9800 XT announced at some point there as well, so we'll talk about that. And yeah, so looking forward to getting over to Perth for a couple of days, like a extended weekend sort of thing, and never been there, so we'll have some fun looking around the city and all that sort of thing. So yeah, that's my life in the next couple of days, so that'll be fun. And yeah, that's pretty much it for this podcast, unless you've got anything else to say about your boring life. But we've been extra boring this week, I think.
Yeah, I think extra boring is probably the best way to describe it. And I don't think I'm going to be any less boring over the next week as I, benchmark Arrow Lake and hunt down benchmark-related issues. So, I mean, that's exciting to me, but...
Yeah, well, it's that bunkering down time of the year, isn't it? Like October, November, that's when everything comes out. We've got to update all of our, recommendation guides and things like that, and all the releases come at this time of year. That said, it seems like most of the GPUs will be announced next year, so we won't have this big glut of things around November.
Kind of nice, I think.
Will be next year. We'll be going to CES for the first time, so we're covering all that stuff there at the show, and yeah, so that will be fun. And yeah, that's pretty much it for this one. Thanks for listening to the end of the Hardware Unboxed podcast for episode 49. We won't be back next week. We'll be back at some point shortly after next week to talk about Arrow Lake and all that sort of thing. And yeah, that'll do it for this one. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.